Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Do we have all of our staff and all of our committee members?
Councilmember Coombs will not be able to join us today, unfortunately.
Okay. Do we have all of our staff?
Yes, we have all of our presenters.
Awesome. So I'm just pulling up our agenda. All right. Let's go ahead and call the meeting to order. Approval of the March 2nd meeting minutes. Councilmember Marcano, do you have any changes? I know you weren't at that meeting, but
Yeah. So, I guess I would have to abstain from that one.
okay. I don't have any edits. We can always bring that back at the next meeting or email Councilmember Coombs to see if there are any changes. April 6th meeting minutes. Do you have any changes, Councilmember Marcano?
No, none from this.
Great. I don't either. So those meeting minutes are approved. We'll move on to our other agenda items. The first one is the 2023 Spring Community Investment Financing Round. And who is our speaker for today?
We'll start with Alicia.
Okay, go for it.
Good morning, everyone. Alicia Montoya, Manager of Housing and Community Development. If we can start sharing, that would be great. And the presentation is on our community investment financing rounds. If we can actually go to the next slide, that would be great. I'm not sure who's sharing, but so just a little bit of background reminder about the purpose of the Community Investment Financing Round applications. The purpose of this program is to make funds available for developers who are looking to build affordable housing in the city of Aurora. We focus specifically on developers whose mission and goals are aligned with the goals and the mission of the housing strategy that was adopted back in December of 2020. Next slide, please. There are policies that we follow also that were adopted during the adoption of the housing strategy. One of those is the expansion of the inventory of housing options throughout the city of Aurora. And so adding housing units is huge. Reminder also that we had a deficit of 7,500 units. We are at about 8,500 units now. So trying to close that gap in this program helps with that purpose. Next slide, please. During the application review process, there are different things that we are looking for in regards to that alignment, or to be more specific, other than the housing strategy. We're looking at making sure that these projects are meeting an identified housing need in the community. One of those could be the average median income, certain demographics, very focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're looking at the cost effectiveness of the project, making sure that we are leveraging the funding as much as, or that they are leveraging funding as much as possible, and that their projects are sustainable. And last but not least, but making sure that the project type, developer, and organization experience are compatible uses for the funding sources that we provide. So making sure that the request actually aligns with the funding sources. As we know, the main source of funding for our projects are HUD and private activity bonds, and there are a lot of restrictions that are aligned with those funding sources. So it's something that we must keep in mind as we are looking at these applications. And actually, I am going to turn the rest of the presentation to Sarah Carroll, as she is the supervisor of the program under Housing and Community Development. Thank you, Sarah.
Good morning. Next slide, please. My name is Sarah Carroll, and I'm the Housing Development Supervisor and serve in the Housing and Community Services Department. The Community Investment Financing Rounds fund affordable housing development projects with subsidy or gap financing, allowing developers to make their funding stack work. As we know, developers still need to earn a profit, and that is particularly difficult when developing affordable housing. Next slide, please. We had a community investment financing committee to review the applications received that consisted of staff from the Housing and Community Development Division, Planning Services Department, Treasury, Real Property Services, and the Citizens Voice representation from the council-appointed Citizens Advisory Committee on Housing and Community Services. The committee met on April 4th and April 17th to review the applications and the funding recommendations. Everyone on the committee was allowed to comment and vote on the recommendations. Next slide, please. Our funding sources are the following: private activity bonds, $23,457,157. Home investment partnerships program funding, $2.3 million. Community development block grant funding, $2.2 million. American Rescue Plan Act funds, $1.5 million, and general funds, $569,000. Total funds available is $30,026,157. Here's some background on each of these funding sources. The Home Investment Partnerships Program funding and Community Development Block Grant funds are provided by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as an annual entitlement grant to the city. These funds can be used for many activities, including producing affordable housing. The private activity bond, 47% of the bond cap each year is issued to cities and counties. The current per capita formula is $120 per capita, and its purpose is to develop affordable housing. The U.S. Department of the Treasury issued the American Rescue Plan Act funds during the pandemic for coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. During this SIF round, we have issued the remaining funds made available to the Housing and Community Services Department. General funds were made available through City Council action. We have awarded all the remaining general funds during this round. Next slide, please. We received 13 applications for scoring. 12 of those applications were eligible for review. The requester for the 13th application already received 3 rounds of funding and was not eligible for a 4th round of funding due to our limited funds. The highest score possible was 100. The rubric was built to score applications that were for development purposes. We received 2 applications for land banking, and the rubric did not consider that activity. However, due to the nature of the projects, the committee felt that although the land banking applications scored lower, the projects were worthy of consideration when final negotiations were discussed and funding was awarded. At the time of final considerations, all funds were awarded. Next slide, please. For private activity bonds, we received 4 applications for a total of $32 million. However, one applicant, an Aurora Housing Authority project, does not plan to begin construction until April of 2024. Therefore, we did not award them their request at this time. They have an additional community investment financing round to which they can apply before construction. We had 2 other applicants starting construction in 2023 that we awarded partial and full awards based on unit count and location. The reason is that if the private activity bond is not utilized, it reverts to the Aurora Housing Authority. We did award the Sanctuary on Potomac full private activity bond, even though their construction begins in October of 2024. Still, we anticipate they will request additional private activity bond for their project in the next spring community investment financing round. Since it has been given support from the state and city, this project will continue to receive full support based on the project type and population they serve. For Home Investment Partnership Program funding, we received 5 applications requesting $7.3 million in home funds. We awarded 2 applications. Both had construction dates beginning in 2023. The remaining applications had construction dates in 2024 and are eligible to reapply for home funds in upcoming rounds. For community development block grant funding, we must meet a timeliness test 60 days before the end of the program year. Our test date is November 2nd. At that time, we must not have more than 1.5 times our annual funding allocation in our account. We received 2 applications for CDBG for $1.4 million. One applicant was not eligible for funding due to being awarded in 3 prior community investment financing rounds. The second applicant was awarded their full ask. Additionally, 2 additional applications were a good fit for CDBG funding. One was a land banking deal that plans to close in September of 2023. We awarded them $1.2 million. The other application was from an applicant we previously took $500,000 from, whom we reawarded. For American Rescue Plan Act, we received 2 applications for $2.7 million. One applicant was not awarded because their application did not warrant their total ask. However, one application was awarded their full ask of $1.5 million, therefore eliminating all the remaining ARPA funding. We have now awarded all $5 million provided to develop affordable housing projects. For general funds, we received 5 applications for $3.5 million. We awarded one applicant a total of $569,000. The Aurora Housing Authority is rehabilitating 80 units of a public housing project, and this was an excellent application to support with our general fund dollars. Next slide, please. The Summit View Apartments is a 222-unit affordable multifamily development set to begin construction in June of 2023. The applicant requested $6 million in private activity bonds and were awarded their full request. Next slide. The Solar Decathlon project is a 3-unit affordable homeownership development using modular homes set to begin in March of 2023. The applicant requested $225,000 in general funds. Due to the minimal impact this will have on our housing needs, the committee felt it was not the most efficient use of funds. Next slide, please. Weatherstone Apartments is a 204-unit affordable multifamily development set to begin construction activities in April of 2024. The applicant requested $7 million in private activity bonds. They were not awarded their full request. At this time, because the applicant has an additional application cycle that they can return and request PAB, the committee made a determination to award PAB to projects with earlier start dates. If those projects do not begin construction in a timely manner, the PAB will revert to the Aurora Housing Authority. Next slide, please. Eagle Point is a 192-unit multifamily development set to begin construction in December of 2023. The applicant requested $4 million in PAB. The committee awarded the applicant $2,457,137 in private activity bonds. Next slide, please. Kings Crossing Village is a 178-unit affordable multifamily development set to begin construction in October of 2024. The applicant requested $2,243,006 in home investment partnerships program funds and $569,000 in general funds. Because this development is not set to begin until October of 2024, the committee determined that this applicant needs to return in rounds closer to construction to seek funding. Next slide, please. Confidential Project is a land banking project for presumed benefit eligible clients under the Community Development Block Grant. The applicant requested $1.2 million in American Rescue Plan Act funding and $1.2 million in general funds. Because the activity and the service being provided more aligned with the Community Development Block Grant funds, the committee awarded the applicant $1.2 million in CDBG funds as the close date on the deal is set for September of 2023. Next slide, please. The Stables is a land banking project with a future 120-unit multifamily affordable housing project. The purchase of the property is set for August 2023, and the development is set to begin in November 2025. The applicant requested $500,000 of community development block grant funds for the purchase of the property. The committee agreed this was an eligible use and awarded the entire $500,000 in CDBG funds. Next slide, please. Sanctuary on Potomac is a 43-unit permanent supportive housing project set to begin construction in October of 2024. The applicant, the Aurora Housing Authority, requested $15 million in private activity bonds. While construction is not set to begin until 2024, due to the nature of the use it or lose it on the private activity bonds and the support of both the state and the city on this particular project, the committee awarded all $15 million of PAB to the applicant. Next slide, please. The Aurora Scatter Sites is a 15-unit affordable homeownership opportunity. The applicant requested $1,050,000 in Home Investment Partnership Program funds. This project is set to begin in April of 2023. Since this is an opportunity to add affordable homeowners to the Aurora housing stock, the committee supported the request and awarded $1,050,000 in home funds. Next slide, please. Willow Park Apartments is an 80-unit affordable multifamily preservation activity. The units already exist in the Aurora housing stock. The applicant requested $1 million in Home Investment Partnership Program funds and $1 million in general funds. Construction is set to begin in January 2024. The committee agreed to award $500,000 in home funds and $569,000 in general funds to support this project. The applicant has another opportunity to request funding at the next community investment financing round. Next slide, please. Elevate Aurora is a 137-unit affordable multifamily construction activity. This project requested $931,000 in CDBG and $569,000 in general funds. This project was not scored as they have already received multiple rounds of community investment financing funding in the amount of $1.75 million. Since we are gap financing and our funds are limited, our process does not allow for more than 3 rounds of funds. Are there any, next slide, please. Are there any questions or concerns that I can address at this time? And does the Horns Committee approve this item to move to the next study session meeting?
Councilmember Marcano, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Councilmember Murillo. So explain to me again, and I apologize, why Eagle Point is listed 3 times on the review panel?
They asked for 3 separate funding sources.
Okay. And
so we had them apply 3 different times. I apologize.
Okay, sorry. And was there a different rubric used for each of their applications?
No, the same rubric was used.
Okay, because they have different scores.
Yeah, since it was different funding sources, that's why they had different scores.
There are different requirements depending on the funding source.
Okay. So what I'm hearing, then it's not exactly the same rubric?
It's exactly the same rubric. It's just because it's different funding sources, there are different elements to funding.
Okay. I guess I'd like a better explanation as to what exactly that looks like on y'all then, just because I want to understand why there's, fluctuation in the points awarded. That's the part that I think I'm really struggling with. But that was my only question.
So, Councilmember Marcano, we can add more to the application sort of criteria piece, but I think it's when you're looking at, does this project qualify and meet the requirements of the funding type? When we're sort of evaluating a project under that category of sort of funding eligibility, that's nuanced for the 4 different funding sources. But we can provide more. I think it's in the first few slides, the application components, the criteria, and just be a little bit more specific about the funding piece.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Councilmember Marcano, just one more thing. They also submit a separate application for each funding source. So each application is evaluated individually according to the requirements of the rubric.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, it just sounds like the same rubric applied to different criteria based on like the funding source. At least that's how I'm understanding it. But Councilmember Marcano, did you have any other clarification on this item or this question or any additional questions?
No, that was my only question.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have any questions. I'm always happy to see us advancing, different parts of our housing strategy, and just seeing that come to fruition. So excited to see that, and I support moving it forward to a study session.
Thank you.
Councilmember Marcano, did you say you approve?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I missed that. Wonderful. All right. Yep, thank you, and thank you for your presentations. Let's move on to our next agenda item, which is the Youth Violence Prevention Program. Let's see, Community Prevention and Intervention Funding Recommendations. Is that Joseph who will be the presenter?
It is. Good morning, council members. Happy Thursday. Joseph D. Herrera, manager of the Youth Violence Prevention Program. And today we're just going to walk through the funding recommendations from the review committee for the NOFO funding. So next slide, please. The review panel this year consisted of myself, our program coordinator, Andrea Wright, our data analyst, Austin Burdett, Captain Mike Hannafin, who is the co-director of our focus deterrence work through the Aurora Police Department, Donna Hunt, our youth superintendent for Parks, Rec, and Open Space, Brandon Wright from Aurora Public Schools, student engagement coordinator, Felicia Rodriguez, who is the manager of the Youth Violence Prevention Program for the City and County of Denver, and Kate Compton, she is a supervisor for youth services with the libraries. Next slide, please. This is just a high-level overview and a comparison from 2022 to 2023. So this year we did receive 22 applications regarding prevention funding, 13 applications regarding intervention funding. On the bottom right, you can see this year we had a total of 35 applications versus 29, which we had last year. And the numbers kind of flip-flopped in terms of intervention versus prevention applications that were received. Next slide, please. So the intervention agencies that have been requested to move forward, this is just a list of those agencies, Struggle of Love Foundation, and they're not listed in any particular order, just to preface that. Collaborative Healing Initiative Within Communities, or CHIC, Chic, Rebuild Our Community, also the road called Straight, Fully Liberated Youth, or FLY, Denver Area Youth for Christ, and then the 18th Judicial Assessment Center, and Colorado Uplift. So for a total of $450,000 for intervention funding. And we're going to talk in a few slides, we're going to talk a little bit more about the funding piece too. So next slide, please. What we did here was we broke down over the next few slides just each agency that applied and what their scope of work very high level looked like, and how that related to the Youth Violence Prevention Program's strategic plan that was adopted last year, as well as the Public Safety Partnership recommendations that we received that we've gone over and presented to council. So I can go through all of these if you'd like. You can see the Denver Area Youth for Christ. Their scope of work was therapy, mentoring, and transition work for those that have been incarcerated in some capacity. This relates directly to Youth Violence Prevention Strategic Plan, Strategy 3 and Goal 1, which is Intervention and Reentry Services. And then the PSP recommendation, or Public Safety Partnership recommendation, this is providing or satisfying the more and better options for youth that are involved in violence. The 18th Judicial Assessment Center, their clinical assessment and resource referrals is their primary scope of work. They are, again, the third strategy, first goal, so intervention and reentry services in relation to the Youth Violence Prevention Program strategic plan. And then for the PSP recommendation satisfaction is the more services for troubled youth and their families. Colorado Uplift is mentorship and education. Again, looking at that intervention and reentry work and providing those services for troubled youth and their families. Next slide, please.
Joseph, I actually had a question on the last slide.
Sure.
For the Youth for Christ organization, is there any like religious requirements? I don't know if that was like the best way to ask that. Obviously they're a faith-based organization. I don't necessarily have any issues with that. I think I would start getting concerned if there was I guess stipulations based on a particular kind of religious path.
Sure. No, I think that's a great question. So there are not no, I guess, to the high level answer to your question. So they have a ministry that's actually separate from this programming that participants are able to be involved with. They were one of our grantees last year as well, and provided a lot of great services for their families, but there's not that kind of expectation that they go down a certain path or they participate in certain activities related to that.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification.
Of course. Next slide, please. So we've got the road called straight. Intervention and case management is their youth program, working on the strategic plan for youth violence prevention, intervention and reentry services, and then again, the better options for youth involved in violence in relation to public safety's recommendations. And then we have FLY, Fully Liberated Youth. Their scope of work focused on mentorship, therapy, and GED tutoring and case management for at-risk youth. Again, really focusing on those intervention and reentry services in relation to youth violence strategic plan, and then giving more and better options for those youth that are involved in violence. Next slide, please. We've got Struggle of Love, and they are focused on their scope of work is violence interrupters, intervention and reentry services, and then more and better options for youth involved in violence. And then last but not least, we have CHIC, Collaborative Healing Initiative within communities, early intervention supports and mentorship for at-risk youth and their families is their primary focus or their scope of work for their application. Intervention and reentry services and more services for troubled youth and their families. Next slide, please. So any questions, I guess, kind of overall for the intervention organizations before we kind of move on to my next piece?
Councilmember Marcano, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Councilmember Murillo. And thank you, Joseph, for the presentation thus far. I did have some questions about the scoring methods used for intervention. And I'm looking and I'm noticing that the average scores are, if we were using school grades here, basically C's to D's. So I'm wondering, is that like normal, I guess? Or do we have like some concerns with some of the folks that we're utilizing here?
I think that's a great question. Yes. So in terms of the scoring, really the goal this year for the scoring with the review panel was to get that diverse group of individuals. And as we were meeting as a committee, it was, I think some folks were grading a little bit harder than others. And so I think that's where some of those kind of lower scores come in. But in terms of the overall scores, it is a little confusing because it wasn't out of 100 points. It was out of 80 points. And so that, yes, that would bump those scores then up a little bit more. So there's no concerns in terms of these agencies and kind of the proposals that we're pushing forward. There were definitely some concerns with some of the other agencies, which is why they didn't make it through and get pushed forward or score as high to pass that threshold.
Okay, great, thank you. And if I could just offer a suggestion, when we get this to study session, make sure you have that somewhere.
Absolutely.
Out of 80, not out of 100. Okay.
Yes,
great.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
You bet. That was my only question for the moment, Councilmember Murillo.
Great. We at other rounds of funding, our council had introduced a set of new, not sure where like their criteria came from. Have you, I guess, incorporated that feedback into this like vetting process? I don't necessarily agree with some of the like arbitrary thresholds that they came up with, but if that's going to be the temperature, I think it doesn't set a good precedent for us to open up funding and then, you know, change criteria last minute. Can you comment on that?
Sure, yes, great question. So we did absolutely take that into account. So part of the scoring rubric, we did have vetting of, you know, social media sites, of how their organizations are, you know, within the community of Aurora, whether we've worked with them in the past or just understanding, kind of having a pulse point of how those agencies that applied show up, whether that's in meetings or show up at events, those types of things. We also did take into account and have the agencies outline any additional funding that was received, from whether that was through the city of Aurora, whether that was ARPA, you know, other funding that they've received, to really understand their budget, but also understand how the programming that they're proposing really is going to benefit, you know, definitely Aurora families, but also we know that there's no boundaries for these at-risk youth that are, you know, going back and forth between Denver. So we did try to take into account a lot of the requests based on what we heard from council. But we did, part of that was, yes, looking into their social media, seeing if they have the programming on their websites, those types of things that these agencies were able to speak to.
Great, thank you. No further
course.
questions on my end.
And to make sure the scoring rubrics included ahead of time, just like we did for the last presentation, I do think that is helpful. So that was an oversight. We'll make sure that that is included, all the criteria.
Councilmember Murillo.
Yes, Councilmember Marcano.
All right, thank you. Sorry, I did want to add that the comments section, after the, what is this big thing? Sorry. Yeah, the case ID with the reviewer names and all that. It is, one, I think, very difficult to read, just because of the amount of spacing between each line, and it doesn't seem like it specifies to whom the comments apply. So I feel like it's missing context. I'm not sure if this was meant to be included in the packet, seeing as I feel like you need a lot of other information to make that make sense.
Sure, we can, we did, yes, intend to have that in there, and we'll revamp the scoring piece and the comment section, of course, for further presentations.
All right, great, thank you.
And just to reiterate too, with study session and full council, the awarded agencies are the agencies we are pushing forward recommendation wise. They will also be at study session, so they will be able to speak to their specific programming if there's any questions that council or the mayor would have. That's really what this time would be opened up for during study session and full council.
All right, fantastic.
Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to add, sorry to interrupt, Joseph.
Okay.
Councilmember Marcano and Murillo, I wanted to share one of the things that Joseph did is he did meet with Scott Campbell, who's also in the same division, because as you know, he does grants every year and has also a review board. So he made sure that it was equitable with the practice of similar scoring, similar practices, similar communication. So I also wanted to make sure you were aware that within the department, for Jessica's department, we made sure that there's a visibility of equity in how we're doing our practices, just as an extra note. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadia.
Yep.
All right, next slide, please. So switching gears to prevention agencies. So you'll see the list of prevention agencies. We have 12 agencies that we are moving forward for recommendation: Boys and Girls Club of Metro Denver, Sims Viola Foundation, Youth Mentoring, which is Big Brothers Big Sisters, Aurora Housing Authority, Junior Achievement Rocky Mountain Division, SOAR, which is Seeing Our Adolescents Rise, Compound of Compassion, Empowering BIPOC Girls Through Entrepreneurship, African Chamber Youth Engagement for Success, Aurora Sister Cities International, A1 Boxing Academy, and Urban Nature Impact. You'll see at the bottom, the total is $202,500. We're going to break the funding down a little bit more because that is over the initial $500,000 that we have for this work. Next slide, please. So Boys and Girls Club of Metro Denver, their scope of work is after school and summer programming relating to the Youth Violence Prevention Strategic Plan Strategy 4, Goals 1 and 3 of secondary prevention efforts for youth and their families. And then with our PSP recommendations, we've got more safe spaces for youth and things for them to do outside of school, those types of things. So speaking directly to that additional need for programming for our at-risk youth. Sims Viola Foundation, so they're focusing on youth mentoring and social emotional learning. Youth Violence Prevention Strategic Plan Strategy 4, specifically Goal 1, secondary prevention efforts, and then more services for troubled youth and their families from the PSP standpoint. The Aurora Housing Authority, so their scope of work is monthly teen nights, or movie nights is what their scope of work really consists of. Again, secondary prevention efforts and more safe spaces for youth and families and for things for them to do. Next slide, please. Junior Achievement Rocky Mountain, so they are focusing on workforce development and financial literacy. Again, secondary prevention efforts and more safe spaces for youth and activities for them to do. Compound of Compassion, so they're focusing on safe zone events. Again, secondary prevention efforts and giving those youth and their families safe spaces and more programming, more things to do. Seeing Our Adolescents Rise or SOAR, community mentoring and educational support, secondary prevention efforts and services, tailored services for youth and their families in relation to our PSP recommendations. Next slide, please. We've got African Chamber Youth Engagement for Success. So they're focusing on entrepreneurial skills, financial literacy, and leadership development for at-risk youth, secondary prevention efforts, and more safe spaces and programming for youth. A1 Boxing Academy, so boxing and exercise classes. Again, those prevention efforts, better options for youth involved in violence. Aurora Sister Cities, they're focusing on civic and community engagement. Again, tapping into secondary prevention efforts and more safe spaces for our youth and activities for them to do. Next slide, please. Big Brothers Big Sisters, so mentorship, their scope of work is specific to peer mentoring for at-risk youth, secondary prevention efforts, and then safe spaces and things for our youth, especially at-risk youth, to do. Next, we've got Empowering Girls Through Entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship programming and mentoring is what their scope of work is, tapping into those secondary prevention efforts and safe spaces, constructive things for our at-risk youth to do. And we've got Urban Nature Impact, so nature trips and mentorships is his main scope of work, secondary prevention efforts, and then better options for youth involved in violence, really, again, removing them physically from the location that they're in and kind of changing up that routine for them. So next slide, please. Any questions surrounding the prevention agencies?
No questions from me.
Okay.
Councilmember Marcano?
Councilmember Murillo, and thank you, Joseph, for y'all's work on this. I know that last year, I think some of my colleagues didn't quite understand the impact that, things like safe zones and just in general, the prevention approach can have. And I'm just wondering if that's something y'all are prepared to address this time.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for that question, council member. I think even the number of applications kind of speaks speaks for itself in terms of we had way more prevention applications than intervention applications for this work in the community. We still will have a greater split between intervention and prevention funding. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to still kind of satisfy the request for more intervention funding, but really be able to funnel a lot more into prevention services, really because that's just what we're hearing as a program, what we're hearing as a city is really getting in with a lot of those prevention efforts.
Yeah. I know that was a pretty clear ask from community members at a event that was held in Ward 1 a month or so ago. So yeah, happy to hear that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. Any other questions? All right, so to break down the funding a little bit more, we are, as a committee, pushing forward the request to fund 7 organizations for intervention work for a total of $450,000. The way that we have recommended to break this down is $400,000 from our 2023 budget, and then utilizing $50,000 from the 2022 budget. So we had 200 and I just want to make sure I have the number correct, $240,400 that was not utilized of the $500,000 from 2022. And so our hope is that we're able to pull $50,000 from what was not used last year to satisfy that $450,000 for intervention as a one-time funding request. For our prevention agencies, we are requesting 12 organizations to be funded for a total of $202,500 to take the remainder $100,000 from the 2023 budget, which would satisfy the $500,000 total for 2023, and then utilize $102,500 as a one-time funding request from the leftover 2022 NOFO budget. Any questions on that or how that breakdown looks?
Councilmember Murillo?
Yeah, I think I cut out a little bit. Would you mind just repeating that? I
Sure.
missed that.
No problem. Yes. So as a committee, we are requesting to fund 7 agencies for intervention work for a total of $450,000. The breakdown of that $450,000 is $400,000 from the 2023 NOFO budget, and then pulling $50,000 from the excess budget from 2022 as a one-time funding request. And to kind of go back to the beginning, we had for 2022, we had spent $259,600 of the $500,000 that was requested. So we had unallocated funds of $240,400. So this $50,000 would come from that pool. For the prevention agencies, we're requesting to fund 12 organizations for a total of $202,500, pulling that $100,000 for prevention out of the 2023 budget to satisfy the full $500,000, and then the remaining $102,500 from that excess from the 2022 budget to satisfy that as a one-time funding request.
Okay, and you're asking to move that forward?
Correct.
Yep, I approve, and I also approve of the Star Wars gifts
Yes.
on May 4th.
Thank you for sharing that with us, man.
Thank you,
I have
Councilmember
a
Murillo.
question on this. So
Sure.
does this include the funding that we were able to find, for lack of a better term, from the Keep the Lights On program, or is this a separate tranche that we're
This
looking?
would be completely separate. Yeah.
Great. Cool. Yeah, and then in that case, I have no objections. Let's move it forward.
Wonderful. Thank you. I believe the next slide was just for questions and the question to see if you approve moving it forward to study session. That is all for me. If you don't have any other questions or if anything comes up later, feel free to reach out. Thank you both.
Thank you for all your work on this.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, thank you for the presentation. Let's go ahead and move on to our next agenda item. I'm sorry, did I miss someone's comment? Okay. Alrighty. Let's move on to the ordinance discussion on habitability. Is Sandra, are you the presenter?
I am the presenter, yes. So thank you and good morning, everyone. So this is an ordinance we're requesting an amendment to a Health and Housing Code 22567 by adding section 22610 to the city code pertaining to human habitation of dwelling premises. So in the packet, there was an ordinance that was provided, and we've added unfit for human habitation to be a structure is unfit for human habitation whenever the code official finds that such structure is unsafe, unlawful, or because of the degree in which the structure is in disrepair or lacks maintenance, is unsanitary, vermin, or rat infested, contains filth or contamination, or lacks ventilation, illumination, sanitary heating facilities, running water, or other essential equipment required by this article, or because the location of the structure constitute a hazard to the occupants of the structures or to the public. So the change in 610 is actually we're adding unfit for human habitation, and also we will be adding a definition of running water to make sure that the locations have running water. And in addition, we'll be changing the definition of applicable health laws by removing the reference to Tri-County Health Department as they no longer exist. So the reason this has come to Council is that over the past year, we've had code enforcement has had multiple properties, both owner occupied or properties where people have taken possession of or are illegally occupying, which do not have running water, no electricity or no heat. These situations have led to complaints or of occurrences of urination and defecation outside the home or the property or on adjacent neighboring properties. Adding running water to the definition as well as unfit, the definition, the section of 22610 for unfit for human habitation would assist in habitability enforcement of dwelling premises which are potentially unfit for human habitation. There's a lot of habitations there. Sorry. So those are what we are looking for to change in this ordinance. Is there any questions or?
I don't have any questions. Councilmember Marcano?
No, I'm supportive of this. So I had one of those properties was in my ward. So I appreciate y'all revising the code to make it more expeditious in the future to deal with those issues.
Thank you. So the question is, do we move this? Are you in agreement to move this towards study session?
I
Yes.
support. All right, looks like that is going to move forward. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
All right, any updates from community members? I don't know if I see. Anything? All right, not seeing or hearing anything. Our next meeting is June 4th. Councilmember Marcano, does that still work for you?
Works for me.
Alrighty. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Take care, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.